Hello, everybody. I'm excited to see a whole lot of people jumping in. Can y'all hear me okay? All right.
I'm going to speak for everybody. Yes, I hear you great, Ray.
Whew. Thank you, because I was starting to wonder if my audio had just dropped. So I'm excited about tonight. We've been looking forward to this for a while now. And as Susie asked if we could extend an invitation to the folks in Marriage on a Tightrope, and as this came up over in the Diamond Dogs group, it's been exciting to see the amount of interest from not just our group, but from those other groups as well. So if you're from Marriage on a Tightrope or Diamond Dogs, welcome.
Do you need something? Go with my show downstairs.
And we're excited to have you. Also need to throw out a quick shout out to Nate Bagley, who made tonight possible. Nate was the one who hooked us up with Dr. Kathleen Smith, who we'll introduce here in a second. And so if you don't know who Nate Bagley is, he is involved in so many different projects, but the one I think you might be most interested in is his Rethinking Porn Addiction Facebook group, where he and a panel of experts and people who've been through this are having an ongoing discussion about sexuality and as it relates to porn and finding a healthier way to deal with problematic porn use. So we're excited tonight to have Dr. Kathleen Smith with us. Dr. Smith is a licensed therapist and author who lives in Washington, D.C. She's written for popular publications such as Slate, Salon, New York Magazine, Lifehacker, Psychology Today, and Counseling Today, among many others. She's a faculty member at the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family and hosts the show Family Matters, a production of the University of the District of Columbia. And of course, the author of tonight's book, Everything Isn't Terrible.
Wow, the green
which just happens to have a cover that's about exactly the same shade as my green screen. So, Kathleen, welcome. I'm grateful to have you with us tonight.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Your book came to my attention as I was talking with Susie Halterman at one point about differentiation, and she sent over a couple of her favorite titles. This was the number one on her list. And differentiation has been a topic of interest for me for quite a while. In my personal journey, I stumbled across David Schnarch and started learning about the principles here. And in my studies as a marriage and family therapist, I ran across Marie Bowen, and we've talked about several books in this group over the last few years that are very differentiation centric. So I was excited to see your take on it, and I was wondering if you'd mind sharing with us a little bit about how you got started down this path, and why differentiation, why Bowen theory, and how did you end up writing this book?
Yeah, so my path to learning about Bowen theory is kind of an interesting one, or maybe not that interesting one now that I think about it. But I was a doctoral student looking for an internship, and I was very anxious about it, as students tend to be. And we're getting some feedback noise. Can folks, if you can mute yourself, if you're not speaking, I think that would help. We're getting a little bit of feedback coming in. Yeah, and I was connected with this place in Washington, D.C. called the Bowen Center, and I hadn't really heard much about Bowen theory before. And they said, if you want to intern here, you have to meet with somebody for a year to work on yourself and your own family. And you have to do our postgraduate program. And I was very intrigued. I was like, wait, I have to work on myself to be able to to help other people? That makes total sense, right? But not a lot of places require you to do that. And so they handed me this book to get started called Extraordinary Relationships by Dr. Roberta Gilbert. I don't know if you all have heard of it. It's a wonderful book that's a fabulous summary of the theory. And I found it I started doing this work. I started meeting with a Bowen coach, and I found it incredibly useful in my own life. Obviously, I had a long way to go and still do, but I found myself sort of being more thoughtful and less reactive in key relationships in my life. And there's a lot of research for, therapists and counselors about which theory is best, which is the most effective. But sort of what the research uncovers time and time again is that, it's the most effective when the clinician actually believes in what they're what they're using and they're doing. And so because I personally found thinking family systems very useful in my own life, I'm just naturally curious and interested about everybody else's story and everybody else's family as well. And so I never get bored of talking about it with people. And so I've been with the Bowen Center for about a little over a decade now, and I'm a faculty member there. And yeah, just love thinking systems and working on myself very slowly but surely. And wanted to write a book that was a little bit less, that wasn't academic. But that also, a lot of self-help books tend to be sort of one idea reiterated over and over again without a lot of substance or behind it. And so I wanted to sort of take this theory that I found incredibly useful, but also be able to kind of talk about it in everyday language and to, there's a lot of mystery, I think, surrounding therapy sometimes because it is very different depending on who you're working with and the theoretical orientation of the therapist, So I wanted to kind of demystify the process and describe sort of what it looks like for people to kind of grow up very slowly and to change how they operated in their relationship. So hopefully that's what I did. But yeah, so that's kind of a summary of how I got to writing the book.
Well, fantastic. And as I've started my own journey into this, growing myself up, I've run into this time and again where I think I'm there. I'm good. I'm in a good spot, and then suddenly life throws something at me. And you mentioned this. Something comes up, and it's like, whoa! How did I just become, a toddler in my own relationship again?
Sure.
And it's not necessarily that I've regressed, but what at least for me, I've found that I've gotten to the edge of my capacity for dealing with that, and now it's time to stretch and develop some more capacity. Um, so rather than sort of walking through the book chapter by chapter, and by the way, I loved the book. I loved your approach to it as well. Emily Nagoski has a similar approach where she takes a very in-depth and diverse topic and approaches it from some composite clients and shares some common stories, and I think that resonates really well. It certainly does with me. But I was wondering, maybe you want to kind of walk us through the basics of the process here of developing differentiation and why that's important.
Oh gosh, I don't even know where to begin. No, I do. I think the one sort of caveat that I will add is that as a student of Bowen theory, I think differentiation can't really be thought about separate from all the other concepts in Bowen theory. So it's useful if it's something you're interested in learning more about to sort of learn about the concepts as well, because they are all connected and related to each other. But I guess to give you the short version, we humans, we like to think that we're these unique mystical creatures, we're special, that we're different than other animals, and that's correct to a degree. But but actually a lot of what we do, how we operate when we are stressed, is quite universal and predictable, and is not that different from a lot of other species. And so, what Dr. Bowen wanted to do, you think about this guy, he's a psychiatrist, he was trained in psychoanalytic theory, he learned Freud and all that. Um, and he wanted to be able to turn sort of human behavior into a science, to be able to say, these are the things that humans predictably do when you dial up the stress. And that these can be observed, these can be predicted, but they also could be changed if you begin to think about it and observe how you operate. And so, there are things that we do in relationship to each other that are, like I said, that are predictable. And I talk about this in the book, right? There are sort of these things like distancing or triangles or over and under functioning that we sort of, they're the automatic ways that we manage stress in relationship to other humans. And they are not good, they are not bad, they are just sort of the automatic response. And that differentiation is a process of being able to sort of slowly turn off or dial down that autopilot and to begin to be guided sort of by one's own best thinking about how to navigate a challenge, to be able to tease apart what you want to do automatically to calm things down versus what you think is the best course of action, you know, when you're dealing with a challenge in a relationship or elsewhere in life. And that humans naturally, we vary in our level of differentiation based on our based largely on our families. And so that's not about blaming our families, but but our position in our families and how, you know, how that family system works and the level of anxiety in the family system has a lot to do with our own capacity to think and act for ourselves. And, you know, and I think most of us, if we're being honest and humble, would say we're pretty low on that scale, myself included, you know, but that because our brain is a malleable thing to a degree, you know, with time and observation and effort, we can increase our capacity to think and act for ourselves in relationship to others in anxious times, and that's useful to think about and work on. And yeah, I guess that's kind of a summary of it. I can go into detail more, but I don't want to lecture you guys on my...
Fair enough. One of the things that was kind of eye-opening to me from Bowen theory is the notion of triangles. And like you said, it's one of the common ways that we manage stress. I'd never considered it a stress management tool before. I just knew that, you know, when something was going wrong and I was mad at somebody, I wanted to go talk to somebody. And it felt really good when they were on my side. And it felt really sucky when they were, you know, being objective and helping me see that I needed to grow. So how do we deal with triangles? You say none of this is necessarily positive or negative, and Bowen, I think, called out that, you know, you can have positive and negative triangles. How do we distinguish? How do we know when recognize when that behavior, the desire to reach out to somebody to help manage this, is helpful and when it's unhelpful?
Yeah, just to give a brief definition for those who aren't familiar, there's this idea that sort of a two-person relationship is inherently kind of unstable, and that we pull in or focus on a third person to manage the tension in the two-person relationship. And so, you know, and the more anxiety you introduce into a system, the more automatic the triangling becomes, and the more triangles you have, right? And so it is useful to think about how our relationships get watered down because we rely on a triangle. You know, I think the classic example is parents focusing on kids, right? You know, all you talk about, all you think about is your children, right? And then the kids grow up and leave, and then it's like, okay, who is this person I'm married to? Because the children or the child has stabilized the marriage to a degree, right? Or, you know, the classic examples of in-laws, right, and tension with that and that triangle. You know, but I think being able to kind of ask yourself sort of what are the triangles in my family, you know, in my sort of immediate sphere, when I'm distressed in a certain relationship, who are the other people that I rely on either to side with me or to calm me down? I think triangles can also look like gossiping, right? If you're always talking about another family member, you could even be like a celebrity or something, I guess. But or if you rely on someone else as a messenger, you know, I never call my brother. I always talk to my mom, and she gives me an update on how he's doing, right? And if, you know, an affair is also an example of a triangle. but I think really asking, Bowen kind of defined this equality of relationship. He called it a person to person relationship. And it was the ability to talk with a person, not just about superficial things, to relay your own challenges and thinking about important topics and to hear the other person's thinking as well. And to be able to do that without always relying on focusing or thinking or pulling in that third person. And so I think it's a wonderful thing to think about, in a romantic relationship, in a marriage, but in any relationship, to say sort of what other people have sort of gotten in the way of me having a closer person to person relationship or one-to-one relationship with this individual. In my marriage, in other relationships, are we always focusing on someone else? Are we relying on another person to relay information to each other? And does that have to be such an automatic thing? I think it's in the workplace
Jenna's
too,
like,
right?
oh,
Like we
this
can,
is going to be a great house to
we
move into, because it's still on our.
Hey, Margie.
somebody needs, okay, we got it. I think it happens with colleagues too. We complain about the boss to each other. It's the workplace, there's just triangles galore. So I think once you start to think about them and observe them in your everyday life, you just really see them everywhere. But yeah, Ray, as you mentioned, they could be positive as well. Going to a therapist as a couple is a triangle, right? Having a third person there can stabilize things a little bit so that people can talk to each other and hear each other. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. But I think when it becomes the automatic way of calming things down, then you can get into trouble because it's harder to keep things calm just when it's the two of you, if that makes sense.
It does. I think it was the movie Runaway Bride, where character comes in and talks to his ex-wife and her new husband, and they mention to him that that they have this fabulous therapist, and it takes a third person to make their marriage work. I think we're probably all in a lot of our relationships in that same space. It does take a little bit of external help to keep us from freaking out and damaging the relationship or running away. So we are well, at least the Improving Intimacy and LDS Relationships group is a sexual intimacy and relationship group. You didn't talk much specifically in your book about sexual relationships, but how do we take what you have shared and apply that to improving that aspect of married life?
Well, the first thing I think of is there's this quote from Dr. Bowen. I can't remember it word for word, but it's something like, it's not the issues that cause conflict, it's the level of reactivity we bring to the issues. And I think you could replace the word reactivity with immaturity, anxiety, all of the above, and so often people think that they need to solve the issue or the difference, and that will calm things down. But but often the opposite is true. Being able to manage oneself and one's own defensiveness, anxiety, reactivity opens up, I think, the possibility of working through issues with sex, or being able to hear each other, or think a little bit more clearly, or be able to be more curious. And so often, people don't think of it that way. It's like, okay, we need to fix this particular issue, versus how do I manage my own reactivity about the topic of sex? First of all, where does that reactivity come from? Is it my family? Is it other things I've been taught? Is it my past experiences? Just getting a sense of sort of the anxiety behind it, and being able to ask yourself, what would help me be less reactive about it? Is it just, often for people, I think it's just becoming more naturally curious about it, being able to educate oneself. We don't bring the the front part of our brain that solves problems and is interested, right? We don't necessarily use that part of our brain when we're dealing with an issue with sex or talking to our partner or spouse about that, right? That's all back of the brain reactive, right? The emotions part. And so and I think also, the entire book is about, managing oneself versus directing, managing, over functioning for the other person, right? And I think often with couples, when there are issues with sex, people become very focused on what the other person needs to do in order to solve the problem or to make things better or for them to be happy, right? We become experts at directing the other person, which is only natural when the anxiety is high, when we feel threatened or defensive, etc., right? We become other focused. And so what does it look like to become self-focused? And also, what does it look like to give the other person space to address the issue or the problem in their own way? I think often couples get this mindset that we have to have a united front. We have to do these things together, in order to solve the problem. But also, I think two people can start to learn and think about sex in very different ways. They don't have to be reading the same books. They don't have to be, maybe going to therapy together could be useful. But I think people can work on managing themselves and being less anxious about it and have a very different path to getting there. But often I don't think people give their spouse the space to do that. So I could keep talking about this.
Thank
That's
you.
sort of my main thought.
By the way, do you prefer Kathleen or Dr. Smith?
Kathleen is
Kathleen.
fine. Yeah.
Okay. So I love. First of all, I haven't heard the triangle explained so well as you did at the beginning. So that was wonderful. I appreciate that. And yay, I love that you're talking about how to own emotions, especially around intimacy. And I'm curious. There seems to be. I don't want to say trend. I don't want to make it a pejorative of any sort. I think there's a place for it. But there seems to be in recent years this idea that, hey, I get to have my emotions and I'm going to express it however I want and you've got to deal with it. Do you find there's a place for that? Or in general, what are your thoughts? When we're talking about ownership and being able to come into a conversation maturely and so forth.
My emotions are valid.
My emotions are valid. I get to be angry. I'm going to yell at you. I don't like how we handled that kind of thing. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, my first question for people is usually, okay, have those emotions been effective, or how you've chosen to express them in the past? Did that work well? Did that work out well for you? Because if it did, then just keep doing that, But often people will say, no, I actually get the opposite of what I want. And so it's not so much whether the emotion is true or not. To me, it's sort of, does how you act when guided by emotion reflect your best thinking about who you're trying to be in this relationship? If so, okay. But often there is this dissonance, right? People think, I want to be respectful, understanding, but also honest about myself and what I'm willing to do and not willing to do, right? And so there is this disconnect between sort of the reactivity and what, and who you're actually trying to be, if that makes sense. And I often, emotions can be useful when they are rooted in reality, but often they are not. And they can obscure or not take into account many of the facts, or they're based on your best guess. We often base our emotions on mind reading, assuming, right? And so being able to sort of ask yourself, what's the reality here? What are the facts? Am I just guessing what the other person is thinking or their motivations, right? So, emotions can be useful. They bring about great change when they're based in reality, but often I think that they're not.
Excellent. Thank you.
So and I suppose this is a common dynamic in many Western cultures. the LDS community, the Christian community in general, seems to have kind of a more difficult time with some aspects of sexual relationships because of the well, not necessarily because of, there I go, looking for cause and effect, but coming from a background and where the expectation is that you will wait till marriage to have sex, and that you will be with this partner forever, for death do you part, in the LDS faith forever, is our goal, and we kind of build our lives and our whole worldview around that. And so you get into a marriage relationship and you discover that the things you've always wanted but were too afraid to ever actually admit that you wanted, but now it's time. um, what's standing between you and getting the sexual relationship you've always dreamed of is your partner. And so of course, we blame our partner, and there's a lot of fear and a lot of shame around that dynamic as well. um, Most other relationships, it's like we can compromise, we can figure this out, we'll take your way this time, my way next time. In a sexual relationship, if that's something that's really important to you, and you find that you start to realize you're not going to ever get to where you think you want to be, that's a huge thing to overcome. That's not an easy thing you can just set aside and say, whatever, we'll do what you like. Well, how do you, and so you combine that with typical pursuer distancer kind of dynamic, which often evolves out of that because we're busy trying to get that thing we want, and they're busy trying to not get overwhelmed by us. um, how do you deal with that from this point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an interesting situation. I mean, I'd also add that I think there are plenty of people, at least from the people I've worked with, who do have sex before marriage, but yet they don't have the openness or the capacity to talk about what they want, or and they still decide to get married, and it still becomes an issue later on, right? So it's also just that capacity to be able to talk about it with less reactivity. I think that a lot of people, even if they are having sex, they just haven't worked on or thought about, and it can cause a lot of issues. And I think it's useful for people to think about before they get married, not just about sex, but to the capacity to talk about any challenging subject, to be able to talk about beliefs, family, sex, money, politics, all the big ones, right? And so and that gets harder to do, I think, the longer that you are married. And so being able to, I talk about this, with a lot of people I work with in sort of like premarital counseling, to be able to just say, what are the topics that bring out the most reactivity in us? What thinking of my partners do I not know or have access to that would be very useful for me to know before we decide to get married? That doesn't have to be a super detailed report on all their thoughts about everything, but I think it does, getting their sense of how they think about sex, what they see the role of it in the relationship as being, how they would like to be able to talk about it if there are issues, that gives you such a picture into a person's capacity to do that, and the maturity of the person you're thinking about marrying, and I think that I think it's sort of whatever the topic is, I think the benefit sort of compounds. It's not just being able to talk about sex, it's being able to talk about anything that brings up reactivity. And the more you do that with any subject, I think the more practice you get to be able to kind of manage yourself if you think about it in your marriage, if that makes sense. But often in relationships, if people are dating, they don't want to do a lot to rock the boat, right? So it's very easy to stay away from those reactive topics because you don't want the other person to reject you or lose interest, right? So
Indeed. Do you have one best suggestion for the pursuer and one best suggestion for the distancer?
You mean like after people are married?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think being able to just so much of changing your behavior goes into observing it, right? I talk a lot about this in the book, um, because often people also there is often a disconnect in how people resolve conflict in a relationship. Some people want to fix things right away, and other people need space and time to think. And a willingness to not do what you usually do to calm things down and to be able to come up with other ways of regulating yourself and your anxiety than getting a certain response from your partner is always a useful thing to practice, And so I think the people who are able to observe the pattern and say, okay, here we go again. I notice that my partner is distancing from me. I'm not going to go after them and send them 20 texts and blow up their phone or call somebody else and complain about it, right? Let me see what I can do to calm myself down, and how can I access my best thinking about what to do next and what is probably going to be the most effective, And can I be curious about the other person's thinking, instead of just focused on how do we fix this as quickly as possible? I think that's part of the idea of Bowen theory, at least, is that it's harder to be so hard on yourself when you see this is just sort of the natural adaptive way that we deal with stress. It doesn't mean you're a bad person or that you're not capable. It just means you're a human who does human things. but you don't always want to hit that button or respond in that way, right? So how do I be more flexible and creative, and how I relate to other people instead of just doing sort of the same boring thing? I call it, when I do presentations, I show a picture of like Neapolitan ice cream, the vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. That's how I think of anxiety. It's like it only has a couple flavors in how we respond, right? And so how do you get like a whole Baskin Robbins of, responses in your relationships? You have to be willing to not always do chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, right? And so I think but also not being hard on yourself when you do what you predictably do for the millionth time. I think it becomes a little bit easier to respond differently. And I don't know if that directly answers your question, but that's how I think about it.
I love that image.
Were you suggesting at the sorry, Ray, Kathleen,
Go
when you asked how do you do it when you're married versus not? Are you suggesting that there's a different way to do this if you're not married?
No, I was just curious what he was referring to. So
that piqued my interest. I was like, ooh. Okay.
And that's definitely the perspective that so many of our group members are coming from. Is, of course, now you're in that marriage, and it can feel like you're trapped when things aren't going well, and you feel unable to resolve that. I love the image of the ice cream, by the way. Welcome to Utah. I think we are the
that's
number
right.
one consumer of ice cream amongst the 50 states and the District of Columbia. If Utah had an embassy over there in Columbia, they'd probably be number one in DC. So we like our ice cream. So you talk about in the introduction, you bring up 3 verbs: observing, evaluating, and interrupting. Interrupting in particular stands out to me because, of course, our natural response, we're in pain. We want to not be in pain. We have a problem. We want to not have a problem. And I don't know if it's socialization or if it's something deeper, but at least for me and for many men, it's like, okay, there is a problem, it must be fixed. But you use interrupting. And I'm curious why interrupting and what the difference is, and how that might change our thinking.
Well, I think I use the term interrupting because I think of it as like sort of how do you switch off the autopilot, and because if you don't have a plan, if you haven't thought about it, and that's the evaluating piece, right? you are always going to do what you normally do, or it's almost impossible to do anything differently, right? And I think that's, I talk to a lot of people in therapy, they're about to go home for Thanksgiving, or they're going to have a big conversation with their spouse, and they say, well, I'm just going to wing it. I'm just going to go do my best. And what happens is we just revert to the same patterns, right? Because that's just sort of how we've been programmed, right? And so it does require a person to sit down and take the time and say, what am I actually trying to do here? Who am I trying to be? How do I hold on to those thoughts when emotions are high? Because that's very difficult to do. How do I not get so caught up in trying to manage the other person and trying to predict what they're going to do or guess what they're thinking, right? And how do I sort of just focus on the only variable I can control, which is me? And that gives me maybe a heartbeat or two of time to not do what I would normally do, right? I mean, I can give you an example. I can't think of one from my marriage off the top of my head, but I have a grandmother who's still living, and her way of managing her anxiety is to feed people. And so she always puts extra food on your plate even when you don't ask for it, and it drives me crazy. But it's such a simple thing. I need to not snap at my grandmother when she put extra food on my plate. Like, I need to come up with a better response, because first of all, it hasn't worked. She still does it. And I don't feel great either. And it sounds so simple, but if I don't do that thinking, and if I don't have a plan and say, okay, here's what's going to happen. What do I want to do? Is there a different kind of response I want to play around with and try out? Then it's very, very hard to do anything differently. And that's a small example. You dial up the stress, it becomes even harder. We get locked into those predictable patterns, right? And often with marriages, it's conflict, right? Insisting that the other person needs to change in order to calm things down. Or becoming defensive and interpreting the other person's thinking as a threat or an insult to oneself, right? And so being able to kind of have a plan is very important. But you also have to observe. That's the first verb, right? You have to not be so hard on yourself and just kind of pay attention to how you function day to day. Often that's a lot of the work that I do with couples, is mapping out the process of, okay, what happens when you fight? You do X, they do Y, you do X, they do Y. We can interrupt this at any point. Who wants to volunteer to try something different? It only takes one of you. Who do you want that to be? Because often our own immaturity fuels the immaturity of others, right? That doesn't mean people are always going to respond great when we do something differently. Often you will get a lot of pushback and people won't know how to respond because you're changing the game, right? But beginning to sort of see, can I play around with my side of the equation? And then I wouldn't use the word fun, but I think it becomes interesting, and I think it becomes less hopeless. Often, I think you mentioned the word trapped earlier. I think people feel trapped when there's a lack of curiosity, right? And it's very hard to be curious about a relationship when things are stressful and when things are tough. I think learning about theory, thinking family systems, is working with a counselor or therapist is one way to become curious, right? But learning about science, I think, is another way to become curious. I have a lot of colleagues who tell people when they have sex issues to go read about prairie voles and like other mammals that have sort of similar bonding patterns, and to learn about sort of from a more objective position, because that somehow takes all the pressure off and all the intensity, right? You start to become sort of naturally curious about how humans function or how other animals function. And I think that's a way of kind of getting interested enough to want to try something different and to want to interrupt it. So that was a very long response to your question, but that's the word I use. So
can I ask a question related to your observing, evaluating, and interrupting? I found the concept of interrupting by having principles that you identify so helpful, like principles for all the different areas of your life. But when I like sit down to actually try to create my principles, like who am I? Who do I want to show up as in my marriage? Who am I as a parent? Who am I in my religious beliefs? Like it's way harder than I thought it would be. And so I'm just curious, like, how do you guide people in your practice to make their list of principles of like who they want to show up as? Because it's overwhelming to me.
Sure, that's a great question. Often I
Where to
ask people.
start?
Often I ask people to start by describing their anxious behaviors, because often our principled behaviors are very different or the exact opposite of how we behave when we're stressed out. Not always. But to ask someone, I'm trying to think, if I think about my marriage, like, what are some things I do when I become anxious? I overfunction for my husband. I direct him and tell him what to do. I assume that I know what he's thinking or what he's going to do, right? And so I flip those behaviors and I have principles, I I will let him be in charge of himself or be responsible for himself. I will, strive to know and understand his thinking about various things, right? Just to give you an example, so that's sort of the opposite of what I would predictably do. So often just starting with sort of what are the behaviors I'm not crazy about? What do I do that hasn't seemed to worked? And what do I actually believe about what it means to be in a marriage? And but I think often just starting with the undesirable behavior. is there a principle on the other side of this if I turn it around? If
That's so
okay.
helpful. Yeah, that's really helpful. Just that gives me a good starting place. Thank you.
Yeah.
I've found that both, going back to your answer, I've found both parts of what you talked about to be vital to making this work. I came out of my family of origin. I had a lengthy list of things I was never going to do. All the things my parents did that I didn't like. Never make my kids eat broccoli, or I think we all come out with a list like that. And I've been surprised at how many times in my life I have opened my mouth and my dad has come out. And things that I swore I would never do, I find I am doing. And I realize later that I'm doing them because I don't have a better way. And so simply not wanting to do something isn't enough. But also there's that mindfulness piece, that ability to have that little bit of space in there that says, I'm going to step back and I'm going to, I don't want to react. I want to do this differently. But you still have to have that already planned out what you're going to do. So
Yeah, I think it can be a hard thing to wrap your brain around, because if you ask somebody, what are your principles as a wife or as a parent, that could be hard to kind of define those things. But to ask yourself on a bad day, how are you parenting? What are you doing? And to start there and to say, is there a truth behind this? What's the disconnect? Am I over functioning for my kid when I want to step back and let them do their own thinking before I jump in? That an important principle?
and something that somebody shared with me once that I've found helpful is, you find somebody, telling you all the things they don't want. And sometimes it's me telling myself all the things I don't want. Ask this one simple question. Well, you've told me what it is you don't want. What is it you do want? That can be a very, that can bring you up short, that question right there.
One other thought I had, I don't know if you all are familiar with Jenny Brown's book, Growing Yourself Up. It's a wonderful Bowen theory book, and she actually has a list of example principles, I think somewhere near the back, and just to give examples. And I think those are a great resource. And I often talk about this. I don't know if you all are subscribed to my newsletter, but I often give examples of sort of turning anxious behaviors into principles for that as well, that just sort of give concrete things, because I think it can be kind of a hard thing to wrap your brain around.
scribbling notes here. Jenny Brown's book and your website, which is?
Yeah, my website is kathleensmith.net. My newsletter is called The Anxious Overachiever. It's at Substack, but if you go to my website, there are links to the newsletter and you can just sign up there. So it's free.
Thank you. So we've had some questions that were submitted. We've talked about a couple of these. And I noticed earlier, Tom, you'd raised your hand. I'd like to spend some time addressing some of these questions, and people are welcome to jump in with their own in between if you want.
I was just going to say it was on Kathleen's comment on openness that, or oneness, that in our culture, and maybe it's the same everywhere, that I think the struggle with marriage, and maybe it's more than sexuality, is that when we get married, kind of supposed to, it's that scripture that says, leave your father and your mother, and you're supposed to cleave unto your spouse, and the two shall be one, right? And so you get into these disagreements or differences, and how can you be one in that situation, right? And so that brings up a lot of that anxiety. And so it was just the way you said that was reminded me of that, and how hard this is. I often think of this as, I know what I need to do. You see that anxiety, you see, approaching those conversations you need to have and trying to do better, as standing on the high dive, trying to jump into icy waters because of the discomfort that brings, right? That's the hard part, is just pushing yourself off that edge to do that. And then realizing that you may not make a 10-point dive, it may look pretty ugly, but get back and try it again, and you'll do better. That's where I think it's the hard part, is just doing that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it kind of goes back to the differentiation. The idea of it's kind of a paradox, the idea that being more of an individual actually fosters greater intimacy, and I would say oneness within a marriage, because it dials down the anxiety and it allows for differences in thinking, potentially differences in parenting, all sorts of things, right? And that it is easier to be close with someone when you are less allergic to who they are, what they think, right, and how they operate. But often we want to push for the togetherness, and that often is what leads to the allergicness.
Yeah, and the paradox is great. It's just such a strong one, because it almost doesn't make sense, right? You think of it the other way, that if we both think the same way, and we have the same opinions and same activities, that life's going to be great, and you don't realize that the difference is what brought you together, right? And that's, you can be your own person, and everything can be fine. So yeah.
And one more thing I'd add about, the challenging conversations and the openness is, I think often we are so sensitive to the other person's reactions, we don't really give them a chance to meet us there, right? And there's something to be said for treating your spouse like they're capable of having a conversation about a challenging subject like sex, whatever. They may not be that capable at first, but no one became more capable because someone else assumed that they weren't, right? Like, maybe out of spite, I guess. But when you put an anxious focus on another person, they don't tend to thrive. So I think giving the other person the benefit of the doubt, or giving yourself space to be surprised by their capability, is a useful thing.
So one of the questions, in fact, one of the very first questions that came in when we put out a call for questions, is actually a very simple one, simple sounding one, about differentiation. And it's kind of a two-parter. If differentiation is differentiating between your own thoughts and your feelings, and then differentiating your feelings and thoughts from those of others. First of all, why do I need to differentiate my thoughts from my feelings? And then what are some practices to learn how to do that?
Yeah, so I probably should have done a better job of explaining this in the book. I guess I'll have to do this in another one. But by feelings, I'm not necessarily talking about like anger, sadness, when you think of your little feelings chart. I'm thinking of although that's a part of it. What Dr. Bowen described as what he called the emotional process. The concept for this is the nuclear family emotional process. But this goes back to what I describe in the book as the 4 mechanisms for managing anxiety. So distance, conflict, over and under functioning, and triangles, right? And so if you think about that way, it's a little bit different, right? It's not saying I need to figure out what I'm thinking even though I'm angry. Yeah, okay, maybe you could think of it that way, but it's I need to be able to interrupt the automatic emotional process that is going on in my marriage, in my family, and my peace in that, and how I participate in that, to be able to think about how I actually want to act. That's a part of it. So there's like the emotional process. And there's also what I referred to before, just, when we're anxious, when we're reactive, right? When there's the emotional piece, right? How that clouds our ability to see what's actually happening, and to think about what we want to do. I think the classic example, I'll give you a couple ones, but one is like as a parent, right? If I have had an anxious, stressful day, or I'm upset about something, I might be interacting with my daughter, who's a toddler, and see her as needing attention, help, when she's actually doing just fine, right? I'm just sort of projecting what's going on with me, and that obscures or prevents me from seeing what she actually needs in this moment, which is maybe to just leave her alone, right? Because she's doing her thing. And so that's the emotions sort of obscure the reality needs, what you actually need, what your spouse needs, what your kids need, right? And or another example would be, if I come home and I'm upset about something, right? And my husband shares his thinking about something, or he says something that I don't like, right? And all of a sudden I'm interpreting that as being an attack on me, right? That's the emotion sort of bleeding through into my best thinking, and preventing me from being sort of objective about a situation. I think of, nobody can be totally objective, right? But there's a difference between seeing things from your corner and hovering above the room and watching all the pieces moving. Right? And that's sort of where this thinking systems kind of comes in. And so if I'm just totally going based on emotion, then I'm only going to be seeing things from my end of the triangle or from my corner of the room, right? Which is a very kind of limited view, if that makes sense. So sorry, that was another but I think we get trapped in these, like, thinking of emotion as just like the feelings, right? And not sort of the automatic processes and the ways that we react, if that makes sense.
So, okay, from a systems thinking point of view, it's not just the feeling, it's the whole process. So then the feeling leads me to behave in a certain way. And as you pointed out, possibly even ignore certain things, see things differently than they might actually be. So I will say one of the very first things my therapist had me do was start practicing mindfulness meditation. He said it would be very helpful for my ADHD, which it turns out it is. But one of the things I've learned is that practice, in fact, one of the very first apps that I had that I was practicing with had us envision that you're sitting on a hillside next to a freeway and all these cars are going by. It's like your thoughts. You're having all these thoughts. And the object of the game is to not run out into traffic and start chasing them. The object is to be able to sit back and just notice that they're passing. So that's kind of the picture I've created with being able to separate thoughts and feelings, is that I'm going to have feelings that come up, and I don't need to be swept away by them. I can have a little bit of distance and actually choose, yes, I will engage with this one. No, I will not engage with that one. Is that in a helpful approach to this, or is that maybe addressing a different problem or a misunderstanding?
No, I think of that as sort of the self-regulation piece, right? And what you because this idea that, Dr. Bowen had, that the individual is not the smallest emotional unit, it's the family or the group, right? And so if you are not using the relationship system and how you function in it to calm you down, then you better have another way because, because it's either them or it's going to be, you know, you know, alcohol, drugs, other things, right? Eating, whatever. And so becoming more responsible for oneself, and I think meditation is a wonderful example of how people become more responsible. You can't. It's not just you got to have the individual piece, and then you got to have the relationship piece as well. If that makes sense.
I like the analogy you gave in the book of learning to shoot a 3-pointer.
Yeah. You can do all the meditation in the world, but you still got to go to Thanksgiving and not lose it, right? You practice on your own, but then you got to be in relationship to other people. So sorry, there's like a thunderstorm here that was really loud. I don't know if you guys heard that.
No, send it our way. We are praying for rain in Utah. So, next question here, and I think this is rooted in the idea that we're there to help our spouses. It's a mutual benefit arrangement. I think it's fairly accurate. And the question is this: how do you help your spouse when they are spiraling and you are already emotionally exhausted yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, it goes back to just observing the automatic functioning, right? Is you helping your spouse really helping them? Or is it because they're making you anxious and telling them what to do is how you calm yourself down? Because you can't handle them being upset and because it's so contagious, right? And it's reciprocal, right? It's not just on you. Is your spouse doing things that encourage you to take control and calm them down, right? Like both people are participating. But I think that goes back to, how do I want to manage myself when my spouse is upset? What can I do so that their reactivity is perhaps a little bit less contagious? As a therapist, I have to think about this with my clients, right? If I'm talking to them and they're very anxious, very quickly, I will have absorbed that and I'll start throwing out solutions and telling them what to do and reassuring them, right? It works in all relationships. And so, you have to think about, what can you do? It's simple stuff part of the time, like relaxing your body, taking a deep breath, asking interesting questions, to get at their thinking. Often it's so simple, but just asking people, that's awful. What are you going to do? Or getting more information for them, or asking them, what could be useful for them in this moment, and I think also being able to talk about it after the fact, right? People might get defensive in the moment if you all of a sudden. And so that's the thing you have to, and I talk about this in the book, right? If you're going to be doing something different, you're going to perhaps be accused of being cold or unfeeling, right? You might get a reaction out of the other person. That's the pushback, right? When you change a behavior, you get the pushback, often. And so just being able to talk about it later and say, what do we want to do the next time around? Or when I'm upset, what do you think could be helpful? I think it could be useful conversation. I also think just thinking about it yourself is a lot of the work. But I think being willing to tolerate just distress being in the house, giving the other person the chance to learn how to calm themselves down. You can do that without running out the door and distancing, right? But that requires some amount of discomfort on your own part.
Definitely does. And in my experience, if you can get there, you can often help the other person to a degree just by being that calming influence. Um, it's easy to think that everything is terrible, um, and it reinforces that when other people get upset around you because you're upset. But
Sure. My husband is much better at this than I am. He can't hear me right now. I think he's much more differentiated than I am, even though the theory is that you're supposed to be at the same level. Because I think I will be complaining about something and he'll just be quiet and sort of asking questions. And even though I know better because it's my job, I'll say, why don't you say something reassuring? Like, I know I'm supposed to be calming myself down, but could you just do this for me in the moment? Even though I know this is an opportunity for me to, to self-regulate. But I think, again, it goes back to that paradox. It doesn't mean that you aren't supportive, but it's out of a more thoughtful place than out of an automatic one of let's calm this stuff down as quickly as possible because I can't stand it when you're anxious, or when you're upset.
right. As you were talking about that, I went back to the stereotypical male response of fixing things, and it feels to me very much like that dynamic. There's a problem. There's something inside me that says, you're responsible for this. You better do something about it. And we want to start fixing because we're uncomfortable with the fact that there's a problem.
Yeah, and I think if I think it's useful for if that's one person's response, it's useful for the other person to recognize that, say a woman, her husband always gives her advice or offers a suggestion and it drives her crazy. And she says, why don't you I just want you to, be there for me and listen, right? To not get upset about that, to just recognize that that's an anxious human response, and you can just ignore it. You could say, I understand you're trying to help, but that I'm not looking for solutions right now. I just want to talk about this and think about it. That's a much calmer response than why do you always try and fix it? Why can't you just listen to me, right? I think
Agreed.
just, not being so hard on the other person and recognizing that that's just one of the things we do.
Yep. One of the best pieces of advice I got as a young married person is ask. Are you looking for solutions, or do you just want someone to, what Nate Bagley would call, hold the trash can?
Yeah.
So, this one is more of a religious space question, I guess.
Hit
Person
me.
says,
I'm a divinity school dropout, so I feel like that sort of qualifies me.
all right.
I said it. Yeah, I'm good. I'm good all things church religion. So
Okay.
hit me.
I'm finding that differentiating within my religious space is very difficult. In Mormonism, conformity is the expectation. There is such little room for being guided by your own principles and separating out your own beliefs and feelings from what the organization says your beliefs and feelings should be. I may be able to differentiate privately, but feel like I could never be public or authentic about it, which is so hard. It's such a difficult process with such pushback, and there is such low tolerance for differentiation that many people just leave the religion altogether. What would you advise someone to do to differentiate within a religious organization like Mormonism rather than just walking away from it altogether? I feel like it's a great place to practice differentiation, and it's like high altitude training that you mentioned in your book, similar to differentiating within a family system. The stakes are so high as far as the pushback and being ostracized from my community. If I were to live more like my true self and live by my own principles that I'm developing, some days it feels like an impossible and futile conundrum. I love that they use that word. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, I am not an expert on LDS practices, but I do, when you're thinking of a family, and I belong to a Methodist church, and I don't know how much you all know about what's going on in the Methodist church right now, but there's a little bit of anxiety. There might be a split, So I've thought about this and presented on it before because I think it's interesting to think about. You know, when Dr. Bowen, in Bowen theory, there's this idea that there's sort of two variables that you look at. There's the level of what he called chronic anxiety in a family and the level of differentiation. And I think they both play a role in a person's capacity and the ability to kind of deal with a challenge, and I think of I think about that it would be natural for there to be a higher level of chronic anxiety. What's the correct terminology? Do I say the LDS church, or what should I say?
Yeah, that works.
Okay.
Call us whatever you want.
First of all, because it hasn't been around as wrong, right? There have been a lot of obstacles, a lot of challenges, a lot of things that that have been threatening to the church, right? And so that just makes the anxiety be up, right? And so that is, I'm assuming that would have been the case, in the early Christian church as well, and so there's also just sort of the external variables about like what has this organization been up against and what is the response to that. The response to that is to like circle the wagons and, and protect everybody and make sure we can keep this thing going, right? And so, and families are like that as well, right? And so I just think sort of recognizing that as a reality, that when a group is faced with challenges, there is sometimes more of an anxious response, I think, to people thinking differently or having different beliefs. And I think that that's not necessarily a good thing or bad thing. It's just sort of what you would expect with a group of humans. And but the flip side of, not the flip side, but the other part of that story is that humans within the organization vary in their level of differentiation. You have examples of people who are able to sort of carve out their thinking and say, how do I be in contact and be a part of a group, based on what I believe and what I choose for myself, but also be thoughtful and figure out who I'm trying to be as a human. And I think that, the higher the anxiety is, I think the harder that can be to do sometimes. But I would hope that there would be examples of people, I don't know who asked this question, but there would be examples of people in this person's life who have somehow managed to do that, And I think people can look in their own families of how people have done that well, how people have not done that well. I think sometimes differentiation looks like staying. I think sometimes differentiation might look like leaving. I don't know, but this isn't an answer of how to do it, because that's the thing about Bowen theory. It doesn't tell you how to do it because it's all about your own thinking. So, I would never tell a person what to do, but I think just taking into account that churches have an emotional history. There's the history, the facts, right? But there's also the emotional history and the level of anxiety that has sort of come along with that. And, there are calmer periods and then there are more anxious periods in churches and in organizations. And I think just kind of being aware of that can help people maybe, I don't know, be less angry and just be a little bit more thoughtful about sort of, okay, who do I want to be in the middle of all this? I don't know. That's just how I think about it.
That seems actually really reasonable to me, to answer that question. Who do I want to be in this situation? Because that's ultimately our goal, right? That's us defining us. So
yeah, and there's the Dr. Bowen had this saying that a person who does everything their family wants, and like a person who cuts off and leaves their family, never talks to them, that's the same level of differentiation. It's like two sides of the same coin.
Yep.
So I think that leaving can be just as a reactive decision as just staying in a situation and falling in line and not thinking for oneself, right? Those are both sort of reactive responses. So different, I don't think of differentiation as doing one thing or another. I think of it as sort of, being guided by one's own best thinking and one's experiences and and one's own reasoning. And
Okay. In his original presentation on Bowen theory, he mentions that within a family, when somebody regresses to a lower level of differentiation or steps up to a higher level of differentiation, there's an immediate response, immediate negative response. We want to restore stasis. We want to restore the norm. So we want to put that person right back into their spot because they make us uncomfortable when they step out of their spot. It makes me think I don't really understand how things work if I can't predict them. But that and in fact, he says, if you don't get that response, you probably haven't changed at all anyway, which I find interesting. But if you stay the course, if you can do that without being reactive, eventually everybody will adapt to you and you create a new norm. And I have been part of that experience in a family. And I can see that very easily happening in a family. I wonder if that scales to something like a church family where you have a bigger group, looser affiliation, and much broader range of tolerance for differentiation.
yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing because people can still choose to never talk to you again. It's not like it's a magic solution to to make everyone accept you and welcome you if you think something or act differently than how they want you to, right? But the idea is that the system will kind of reorient itself, So I guess what I explain to people is like, if you decide to stop over functioning for a family member, that does not mean that they're going to become more capable. They might, or they might go find someone else to overfunction for them. But you're not doing it, right? And so this idea that the system will naturally kind of rebalance itself doesn't always mean that people will respond the way you want them to respond. It just means that you don't have to participate in a way that you don't want to, or that it's not reliant on you to kind of stabilize things in the same way, if that makes sense.
I really appreciate that clarification there, Kathleen, because that's my clients will often come back to me and say, well, I did exactly what you said and they didn't change. And I have to go back and remind them it's about differentiation and letting go of that responsibility. So I appreciate you pointing that out. It's not about controlling or changing somebody else or expecting this result. It's about you. Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Bowen had a quote about that in his book because people always kept asking him, well, what are the techniques? Give me the tools and the techniques, right? And he said, techniques are formed out of the desire to control and direct others, and not that techniques can't be helpful, but I think it's easy with family systems to get trapped into the mindset of, if I push this button, I will get this result. And it doesn't always work that way.
Exactly.
So I think people have to recognize that, if there's cutoff in your family, and you were trying to reach out to someone, they might not be open to that, or if you take a position on something, in your marriage, it's possible that your spouse will want to leave you. I mean, those are all realities, right? So that becomes more about sort of defining oneself versus getting the result. But I think people do have to think about, what are the potential costs of this behavior, and is that something I'm willing to live with or not? Because maybe you aren't.
Right. Tanisha.
Sorry, so we're getting very far away from sexual intimacy. I apologize, but it's all related.
It is all related. This is valuable. It is. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Tanisha, you had a question?
I do. First, I apologize for cracking up right there. Did y'all see his dog fall off the couch? It was hilarious.
No, I missed that.
She does that. Sorry.
It was funny. He's back up there now, but okay. So one thing, aside from everything that we've talked about, and I guess this is just a piece, but it really stood out to me in a weird way because and I'll just be super brief. But so a while ago, a few years ago, I found myself over functioning in an abusive relationship. And once I found out that I mattered and had power in my life, I was able to leave, and I was able to safely leave. And when so this part in chapter 8 reminded me of that in a side way, but in the like more direct way to what you were saying. You said, okay, I don't remember what you said, but here's what I thought. It was about having our significant other do too many things for us, and how our skills get rusty and all of this, and how I just left. I didn't leave. I just noticed that in a friendship, and I just backed off those pieces of the friendship where I was relying on them too much. And I noticed how it kind of knocks you down the rungs of your empowerment ladder, and how directly that ties into your confidence. And so when you said, it was just like a moment that it really stood out to me, and I can't remember exactly what you said, but it was really powerful to me to think, oh my gosh, I just did that. And also to think back about how I was making my ex, who was abusive, reliant on me in a similar type of way, I guess. So I guess my one, I just wanted to say that, and two, I just wondered if you could elaborate on that, the psychological effects of that type of thing. Like I said, your self-reliance goes down, your confidence goes down as a major result of that. And as soon as I flipped it, my confidence just like shot back up, because I realized I had gotten into this rut. So thank you.
By flipped what? What do you mean?
As soon as I noticed that I was being too reliant on them for certain things, I immediately stopped. I started doing those things for myself. And then my confidence just kind of went right back up where I didn't notice that that's what happened until you said it in the book, but I had just done it like a couple of weeks ago.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think there is something about being in a romantic relationship, especially in a marriage, that I think of it as sort of a Venn diagram. There's just a little bit of self that gets lost. Your capacity to do things when you were single somehow, I always give the example of taking out the trash. My husband does that, and when he's gone and I have to do it, it feels like the most Herculean task. It's like, look at me, I'm great, I'm taking out the trash, but it feels so hard, right? And that's because that muscle I don't exercise as much. And I think that doesn't mean that that everything has to be 50-50, or that you have to know how to do everything your spouse has to know. I think it's useful to ask yourself, what did I never learn how to do that could be useful for me to know? What are the gaps in my own maturity that never really got filled because I always had somebody in the house to do that for me? And I think that could go from, doing your taxes to calming you down, right? It sort of runs, it's a wide range of things, right? But I think that's another challenge, when people get married young, right? Is some of the sort of natural adulting that might occur for somebody who's single for longer. You don't really get as many of those opportunities. And so I think it's useful for people to ask themselves, what skills or what capacities could be useful for me to learn more about or know about, so that I don't always have to default to, or where have I not learned to be responsible simply because there was another person who is going to do it? And it might actually be useful for me to know some of these things. And again, that doesn't mean you have to do everything, but I think, like you said, it does build up your confidence and remind you that you're a capable human. So sure. And I think same idea, where are opportunities for me to step back and not necessarily just automatically do things. And it's useful for my spouse to begin to do them as well.
Thank you.
So I'm at a point in my life that I thought would take a lot longer to reach. I've got one child that's already moved on, one that's threatening to, one that's in college, and one who's entering senior year of high school. One of the things that I never had thought about having to learn to navigate is how to parent adult children. And in thinking about that, and in thinking about how to teach children these principles, what advice do you have, or what steps do you think would be helpful in teaching this while they're young, and then adapting to when they've started to fly, letting them fly?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy, you know, when you're learning about this stuff to just jump into teaching mode and say, well, let me tell you about X so you don't repeat so the next generation, you know, has a better chance than I. You know, and I think it's simple, but I really do think that, you know, that modeling is so important. You know, it's sort of thinking about you're one-to-one with the child, how you interact with them. Do you treat them like they're capable? Do you strive to know their thinking about a situation? And then what's the one, you know, if you're married, what's the one-to-one between you and your spouse? Because I think that that's still useful for kids even when they're adults, you know, to see their parents, you know, not over functioning for one another. You know, and I think that makes a difference. You know, some that's the one of the things I love about Bowen theory is that to be interested and everyone gets the benefits without having to do the work. So like the sweet spot is to be married to somebody who's working. And you don't have to do that, right? It just sort of, you know, you're doing the readjusting and then they have to, right? And so you know, sometimes adult kids will become naturally curious and say, you know, you seem different. What have you been doing? What have you been thinking about? But I also think just having access to a human who thinks you can handle your challenges and who is curious to know what you think, I think that's incredibly powerful. And often our parents don't relate to us in that way. And so I think that alone makes a really big difference.
Okay. We'll try to proceed along those lines. By the way, my wife is also on this call, so now the secret's out. She can coast because I'm doing the changing. Just kidding, sweetie. We are getting close to the end of time, and it's been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate all the insights you've got to this conversation as well. I have one last quick question that is much less about practical application, maybe more of a technical question. The person says, what therapy methodology seems to pair well with the book's approach to healing and wellness?
Yeah, well, that's I am trained in Bowen theory, so that's the answer to that question. But again, it's I think it can be frustrating for folks because it is less about technique and it is about you know, it is more about differentiation, right? And as a therapist, that's my job, is to be to work on my own differentiation and how I relate to my clients, because that's more helpful to them than me, you know, guiding them through a technique or telling them what to do. You know, just having same thing as what I talked about, you know, just with your kids, having access to somebody who's curious about your family and about your story and about your challenges and what you're going to do about them, I think is a useful thing. So yeah.
All right, thank you. We want to thank Kathleen for being with us tonight. You're in the East Coast, right? So it's almost 11:30 there.
Yeah, it's late. And just one more thing, Ray, I will just plug my newsletter one more time because I
Please
think
do.
it is a really useful resource, and I think it's you know, it provides a lot of concrete examples of what people are up against in their relationships. And you know, I send it every other week, and I think it's a good for people who don't necessarily want to dive headfirst into some of these ideas, you know, academically. If you just want a kind of a weekly reminder to pay attention to yourself, I think it's a good one. So you can just go to my website, which is kathleensmith.net, to find out about that.
All right. So next month, we are going to be reviewing or talking about Dr. Julie Hank's book on assertiveness, called the Assertiveness Guide for Women. So that will be July 12th and 8 o'clock p.m. Same bat time, same bat channel. And with that, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate all the questions that everybody had, and hope you all have a good night.
Thank you. That was so informative and insightful and helpful.
Thank you all. Have a good week.